To understand the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, you have to really understand Joseph Smith's life, which is quite tricky because he never wrote anything down. The vast majority of what we know about Joseph Smith's life prior to the Book of Mormon is from later sources that are talking in retrospect about things that have happened in the past. I've constructed a simple timeline that I'll go through just quickly in this video, and then we'll start to hone down on the events. Joseph is just 10, still recovering from leg surgery, when his family is warned out of Vermont, New England, and makes the migration through to Western New York. We know that they settle in Palmyra in 1816 and have a little pie and beer shop. We have a legal case for Joseph Smith Sr. in 1819, and then they acquire the Manchester farm at that same year. We have some indication about an interaction with a guardian on the 21st of September 1823, and shortly after, Alvin suddenly dies on the 19th of November. There is a report about the disturbance on Alvin's body in September of 1824. In the latter part of 1825, Joseph Smith is recruited by Josiah Stoll for treasure digging because of his seer prowess, and he travels with his father and the money diggers to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where he boards with the Hales. The mortgage on their farm is recalled at Christmas of 1825, and the Smiths become heartbreakingly tenants on their own land. Joseph leaves home at the beginning of 1826. He's 20 years old, and he goes back to the Harmony, Pennsylvania region. He's just over the border in New York, staying with Josiah Stoll and working for him, doing some more digs, smaller ones, and then he's working on Josiah Stoll's farm. He's trying to see Emma. He's also doing quite a bit of schooling because he wants to improve himself, and he spends pretty much the whole of 1826 in that area. In March, he's brought up on charges of being a disorderly person. Josiah Stoll's nephew is worried that Joseph is taking advantage of him. It seems to be a minor conviction, and he's let go because of his youth and with a promise of good behavior. In January of 1827, after Isaac Hale refuses Joseph's request to marry Emma, Joseph and Emma elope across the border and get married, and Josiah Stoll takes them through to Manchester to the Smith family. September of 1827 is when all of the Hill Cumorah acquisition of the plates happens, and there's a lot of excitement around Joseph and Emma. But Emma is not happy. She sends a letter to her father requesting some of her items and goods, to which he replies that she's welcome to them. Peter Ingersoll, a neighbour, takes Joseph and Emma to Harmony to collect her goods, and this prompts a tearful reconciliation between everyone. Isaac offers Joseph an opportunity to come and live with them if he's willing to work hard, and so Alva Hale then goes up in the end of November and moves the couple back down to Harmony, Pennsylvania. In February of 1828, Martin, who's given Joseph some money for this move, comes to Harmony to investigate Joseph's claims about the plates. He then takes characters that Joseph writes down to prominent professors and is convinced that there's something there. Martin then moves to Harmony, Pennsylvania with the couple to start being Joseph's scribe between April and June of 1828. On June 15th, Emma has a baby, which dies. Emma is gravely ill. Martin's taken the manuscript back to Palmyra, and Joseph goes to retrieve it weeks after and finds that it's lost. This is a huge disaster. Sometime in July or August 1828, Joseph is bereft and tries to join the Methodist church that Emma's family belongs to. It's a miserable next few months. But by February, Joseph Smith Sr. comes to visit, and Joseph's spirit is renewed. He's got a new commitment to the project and the Book of Mormon. Martin Harris visits again in March. And then Oliver Cowdery comes with Samuel Smith in April and becomes Joseph's principal scribe. Oliver helps Joseph secure a mortgage on the farmlet so he's not reliant on Isaac Hale. But by the beginning of June, persecution is mounting in the area, and Oliver appeals to his friend David Whitmer in Fayette, New York, and he comes and rescues the couple and delivers them to the Whitmer farm. By early July, the Book of Mormon project is finished, and soon after, in October, Joseph goes back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, while Oliver and Hiram work on the printing with regard to making a copy of the manuscript. January 1829, Joseph has to come back to Palmyra because there's some disputations around copyright infringements on the Book of Mormon printing. There is also some concern that the Book of Mormon is not going to sell because the people of Palmyra are going to boycott it. Joseph sends a group of men in February to sell the international copyright in Canada. At the end of March 1830, the Book of Mormon starts rolling off the press, and on the 6th of April 1830, the church is organized. And those are basically the big events of Joseph's life that we know leading up to the publication of the Book of Mormon. We'll now go through in more detail so we can flesh out some of those particular circumstances. One of the biggest changes in Joseph Smith's life was his migration from Vermont through to Western New York. A volcano that had erupted in Indonesia had coated the earth with ash, and this meant that, particularly for New England, they had a couple of summers without a summer. In fact, crop failure was a huge part of the economy, and those who were already in poor, which were particularly the Smiths, were vulnerable and were warned out, basically told to leave, and they made a big choice to go to the new frontier of America in Western New York. Thousands of New England families did the same. The Smiths settled in Palmyra, which was on the banks of a newly created canal linking this Western New York area through to New York City. It was an ambitious public work. This canal linked this whole Ohio region through to the city of New York and provided a fast, reliable network that got goods from the interior hinterland farmland through to a growing city. Without it, New York would not be what it is today. This allowed the Smiths to thrive, and so after they arrived in 1816, they were able to have a little business that gave them enough money to put down a mortgage on a little bit of land just out of Palmyra Township over the county border in Manchester. They built this little log cabin just north of that border, and they worked the farmland south in trying to turn it into a little productive farm. Lucy Mack is really the only person who talks about this whole time frame, and you get from her writings that this move from New England through to Western New York was really big for the family because they were steeped in being New Englanders, and they had a huge, rich heritage there that they were now giving up. But they were willing to go into the wilderness to be provided for, to find prosperity, and to be led by God. Lucy recounts in her writings a number of visions and dreams that Joseph Smith Sr. had, one of which is very similar to one that made it into the Book of Mormon about a tree of life. And there were a number of similarities between the Smith family and Lehi's family as they migrated to a promised land. Lucy made mention of the fact that Joseph Smith was persecuted by some older boys in the team that they were traveling with. Lucy herself had recently given birth and was breastfeeding along the way, and this makes its mention in the Book of Mormon. Conflict and lack of resources marred their journey from Vermont through to Western New York, and this is the same with the Lehi family as they traveled through to America. The first family of the Book of Mormon also acquired sacred metal plates, brass plates, that told about spirituality and enabled the family to travel with confidence. In Lucy Mack's retelling of this migration, she is the great hero who makes this all kind of possible, and Joseph Smith Sr. is a little bit less than. But in Nephi's telling of this Lehi story, Lehi is the hero and the mother Sariah is a faithless complainer. And this may well have been Joseph's impression of the dynamics between his parents around this really big life change and location direction. By the time that this particular part of the Book of Mormon was being recorded in June of 1829, Joseph had a much greater connection to his father and desire to see him be elevated as the family head and visionary than perhaps Lucy does recount later. And also Joseph is taking up a bit of a mantle at this point as the family head. And this is the same kind of dynamic that Nephi is portrayed in the beginning of the Book of Mormon, who is now taking over from his father Lehi as the spiritual director of the family. All of this seems to give us a great insight into how Joseph felt about this migration from his homeland in Vermont through to Western New York and the kinds of opportunities it provided for him to then be the leader in his environment. And for the Smith family, it gives a good insight into their new life in a new land. Next on our timeline is Joseph Smith Sr.'s 1819 court case. The Smiths were working for somebody and got payment in the form of horses. When those horses were lame, they complained to the courts that they had been swindled. The court upheld their complaint, but the defense filed an appeal, and the Smiths did not put in the right paperwork. So their appeal was upheld, and they even gave damages to the defense, which meant that the Smiths were out of pocket. They had believed they had won, but then on appeal they completely lost. This trickiness in the legal system was something that particularly poor and marginalized communities suffered from and found the legal system to be really punitive and unfair and unjust. These kind of sentiments were also in the Bible because it was written by poor, marginalized people, and these kinds of things entered into the Book of Mormon with the same kind of rhetoric, that judges and lawyers were just out to serve themselves and that they would take advantage of anyone they possibly could. Joseph Smith Jr.'s run-in with the law in 1826 as a glass looker solidified this frustration. Lucy Mack Smith in her history also talks about a court case in early 1829 where Lucy Harris, who's the wife of Martin Harris, took Joseph to court on the basis that he was defrauding her husband. We actually don't have the court records for this, so it's hard to tell if this event actually happened, but it seems likely that Lucy Harris was really against Joseph Smith and believed that he was out to undermine their family. If this is the case, then there were 3 court appearances that the Smith family were involved in before the Book of Mormon was produced. Their experience with the legal system and corrupt judges and lawyers were the basis for some of the things that were written in the Book of Mormon. And because other people in the same poverty circumstance were having the same experience in the court system, they probably felt a great deal of affinity with the text that talked about these things in ways that made them feel valid in their frustrations and their condemnation of the law. Joseph continued to have conflict with the legal system, and I just recently was on a podcast with Megan Connor about this, and we talked about some of these court cases, so it's worthwhile going and having a listen to that podcast. The episode is called "Why Was Joseph Smith Arrested So Many Times?" States in America had a robust legal system, and Joseph's interaction with that system is really fascinating and worthy of some investigation. If Joseph Smith is the creator of the Book of Mormon, we should be able to tie events and storylines in the Book of Mormon to him. And I think we absolutely can. Joseph grew up in a time where Christian adventure stories were the dominant narrative. Pilgrim's Progress, which is John Bunyan's 17th century novel that talked about becoming more godly, was a huge bestseller. And then in Joseph Smith's own day and age, there were such things like the view of the Hebrews that talked about the Indian origins and linked them through to God. The idea that you could write about something related to your Christian adventure and your Christian progress was a really important part of early 19th century America. So what was Joseph Smith's Christian adventure story, and what did it look like? In 1819, Joseph is 15 years old, and his family puts down a mortgage on a little patch of land just south of Palmyra Township. Lucy Mack Smith, in her history, recounts the events, that she was using her textiles work to support the family while her husband and sons were clearing the land for a farm. Alvin, the oldest, was really the hero here. He was the go-getter. He made things happen. He was looking to provide for the family long term. And as a young adult, he was strong and capable and smart. And he led the family. In fact, he provided for them in ways that Joseph Smith Sr. was not doing. He even started to collect material that would become the frame house for the family to live in, apart from their log cabin, which they were cramped in. But in November of 1823, Alvin suddenly dies due to medical misadventure. This throws the whole family into turmoil. Alvin is basically the head of the family at this point, and he's providing all of the leadership, and now this is gone. Lucy is incredibly capable, but she's a woman, and there are limits to the amount of influence she can have on the legalities of the family. The farm project defaults back to Joseph Smith Sr., who is not very reliable. He's more interested in speculative treasure digging, of which he's inducted his youngest son, Joseph Smith Jr., into. And because the land agent has died, nobody comes to collect the mortgage, and he utilizes the funds to get the frame house built. This provides some comfort for the family, but there is very little income coming in. Treasure digging becomes their economic position, which is really tenuous. But it has some notoriety, and when Josiah Stoll comes to Palmyra to hire Joseph Smith Jr. as a seer and Joseph Smith Sr. on the dig in Harmony, Pennsylvania, the two men travel to Pennsylvania to the Hale farm to engage with this dig. Lucy Mack recounts that it's while they're away that the farm is put under mortgagee sale. She talks about how she has to engage Lemuel Durfee, a neighbour, to buy the property and have them as tenants. And in order for this to happen, Hiram has to do the paperwork because he's a man. They heartbreakingly become tenants. And Hiram Smith, who's now the responsible man adult, becomes the default head of the household. But Lucy's actually pulling the strings because she's just incredibly frustrated that her husband has lost the plot. Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. return to Palmyra to a lot of distraught people. And Joseph ends up fleeing back down to the area in Harmony, Pennsylvania for the next year because he just doesn't want to be involved. The Book of Mormon recounts this history as the idea of kings in the book of Mosiah. There is a king called Mosiah who is in a place called Zarahemla, and he's worried about his family who are in the north at a place called Nephi-Lehi. He sends some emissaries to inquire about them and learns of the history of that area. There was a righteous king called Zeniff who had gone into the land, a hostile enemy territory, and provided a great building project where he secured the kingdom for his people. But after he died, his wicked son, King Noah, went under a big building project, extended himself, was not very useful, was involved in adulterous, riotous behavior, held a court with a great deal of people who supported him, and then effectively lost the kingdom. His son Limhi became a tributary king, basically a tenant on the land, as a form of appeasement to the local enemies. His advisor Gideon was the one who was really in charge, who managed to broker the peace and provide for the people. And if you haven't already figured it out yet, King Mosiah is Joseph in Harmony, Pennsylvania. King Zeniff is Alvin, who's the family leader and established the kingdom. King Noah is wicked Joseph Smith Sr., who is not quite a great leader and who basically loses the family farm. And King Limhi is Hiram, under the direction of his mother, Gideon, who is providing for the family in these tough circumstances as a tenant on the land. Their rescue will be enacted by Mosiah, just like Joseph Smith Jr. will save the family. We'll dissect this story in the Book of Mosiah a little bit further in future videos. Alvin Smith's death on the 19th of November 1823 was a pivotal moment for the Smith family. This changed everything. Lucy, his mother, tells a story that it was devastating. She believed it was medical misadventure because of an unknown doctor who came to help him with some stomach problems, who exacerbated that and ended up killing him. He was the effectual patriarch of the family, and he kept everybody together, motivated to work towards the farm and to build a house for comfort for the parents. He was making sure that the mortgage repayments were happening and fulfilled, and he also fulfilled a role as a father figure for Joseph Smith Jr. William Smith recounts much later that at his funeral, the family is shamed because Alvin is not baptized, and this puts a lot of strain on the marriage between Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack, who are competing against each other in terms of religious ideology. Lucy is from a Calvinist background, and Joseph Smith Sr. is from a Universalist background. And these two competing versions of Christianity play out in the Smiths family home, where Lucy really wants religion. She wants to be baptized. She feels aggrieved that the children aren't baptized, particularly now that Alvin's died. And Joseph Smith Sr., he believes that God will work all things out from the beginning like a good Universalist, but he's also engaging in folk magic much more seriously than Lucy, and treasure digging is a big part of his religious observance. When revivals come to town in early 1824, Lucy and Hiram and Sophronia and Samuel all join the Presbyterian Church, while Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. decide to spurn church attendance. This creates a massive religious divide in the family, which you see in the Book of Mormon talking about these different competing ideas, particularly anti-universalism. We see echoes of Alvin Smith in the Book of Mormon text, particularly as I've talked about with the character of Zeniff discovering and establishing the new kingdom. But we also see him as the patriarch Lehi, blessing the children and giving them an inheritance in the new world. Lucy Mack, in her history, talks about how Alvin, knowing he's going to die, gathers the family around and talks to each of the children and gives them a charge concerning their parents. This was reminiscent of biblical patriarchs giving a blessing to their progeny, and it happened in the Smith household, which also managed to make its way into the Book of Mormon. You can visit the gravestone of Alvin Smith. It's on the little cemetery in Palmyra on the hill, and this is what the stone looks like. This newer stone also encapsulates the old stone, which is placed into the back of it. Joseph spoke many times about his beloved brother Alvin, and it's believed that the child that Joseph and Emma lost in 1828 was also named Alvin after his brother. The plight of those who are not baptized is mentioned in the Book of Mormon, with the understanding that the innocent and the ignorant of God's laws will be received into heaven. In this way, Joseph was able to comfort his parents, particularly about Alvin and their choice early on in their marriage not to baptize their children, because those who do not have the law are not subject to it and will be saved, like those who are innocent, like little children, like baby Alvin. Joseph goes on to have a revelation where he sees Alvin in the celestial kingdom and determines that he doesn't need baptism. But then, of course, by 1840, when Joseph is enacting baptisms for the dead, Alvin is baptized at that point. But in 1823, when Alvin dies and the subsequent loss of the family farm because Joseph Smith Sr. is not able to make the mortgage payments, is a really big change for the Smith family and changes their life direction. If Alvin hadn't died, the Book of Mormon and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would not exist. The story of King Noah and Abinadi in the Book of Mosiah is a classic good versus evil narrative. It's also infused with a ton of biblical symbolism, the idea of a righteous prophet standing up to a wicked king. Abinadi recounts the Ten Commandments and passages of Isaiah that talk about the coming of the Savior, and in this way Abinadi condemns King Noah and his wicked priests. But there is one priest, Alma, who believes Abinadi, and despite the fact that Abinadi condemns the court and Noah and they put him to death, Alma flees and takes those righteous principles and teaches them to others. We have already talked about how King Noah can be representative of Joseph Smith Sr., and the idea that the court can actually be the money-digging gang that he has arranged, including his son, Joseph Smith Jr. In late 1825, Joseph Smith Sr. and Jr. traveled to Harmony, Pennsylvania with Josiah Stoll to work on a dig near the Hale farm. They board with Isaac and his family, who are devout Methodists, and Isaac even signs his name on the witness statement of the agreement for these money diggers. We have from Isaac Hale's 1834 statement a number of observations about this particular time. The idea that Joseph Sr. and his son Joseph Jr. fought during this period, and that Joseph Jr. gave encouragement at first about the treasure, but then quickly determined that it was a bust and dissolved the operation. Isaac also talks about his disdain for this magical practice which he does not believe and which he thinks is a delusion and a fraud. He later berates Joseph Smith Jr. about his involvement with the money diggers because Joseph becomes interested in his daughter Emma, and Isaac Hale, as a devout Methodist, does not want this presence in his family. I think the court of Noah really reflects the conflict that Joseph has about his fathers, his natural father, who is a money digger, who is leading the family out of prosperity and loses the family farm, and his father-in-law, or would-be father-in-law, Isaac Hale, who is a righteous man of God, who's a devout Methodist, who is preaching about Jesus and trying to encourage the money diggers in his area that this is not of any righteous endeavor. And just like Alma breaks with King Noah, Joseph Smith Jr. breaks with his father, and he doesn't want to do this money digging or be involved in this court, particularly as the consequences mean the loss of the family farm. Plus, he's interested in pursuing Emma Hale, and he needs to be more righteous to endear himself to her father. So Joseph moves to South Bainbridge and Colesville in an effort to be closer to the Hale family. And there he determines to follow a more Christian path rather than the folk magic culture that is causing a whole lot of problems in his hometown. King Noah is pretty angry with Alma for deserting him, and the same is true of Joseph Smith Sr. losing his best seer in this treasure digging gang when Joseph Jr. moves away. We know from family friend Peter Ingersoll that Joseph's break, apart from the money diggers, is a really big deal for the family. And this may well have been the genesis to turn these treasure digging stories, this folk magic culture, into more Christian belief by enacting the Book of Mormon and its religious component. Righteous King Limhi, who succeeds King Noah, ends up sending out some people who find a precious gold record. And it's revealed that this record talks about the ancient people on the continent and their destruction due to wickedness. Joseph's use of a story within a story to tell about his own story is such a fascinating bit of storytelling. And utilizing the dynamics between his own father and his father-in-law to tell his story of redemption is also genius. 1826 is a big year for Joseph. He leaves home. He's 20 years old and he strikes out on his own. This is a really big deal because the Smiths are incredibly poor and they need every hand available to work so that they will be able to survive. It's possible that with the loss of the farm, Joseph Smith is just using that opportunity to go elsewhere to create some income and then send it back to the family. But no one really talks about that, and Lucy Mack is the only one who's really recounting Joseph Smith's early life, and so this particular year, she's not able to give us any great information about what happens to him. Joseph ends up in South Bainbridge working for Josiah Stoll on his farm. And we know he does a little treasure digging for him on the farm because Josiah's nephew complains to the law that Joseph is a disorderly person and a glass looker and defrauding his uncle. In March of 1826, Joseph has a trial and is held in custody. Several people testify to Joseph Smith's stone in a hat as a use of treasure digging. And one instance, they talk about the idea that during a treasure dig, Joseph gets worried because he sees in a seer stone, anciently, there was an Indian who had murdered another Indian and thrown him into the hole with the loot. These are classic treasure guardian stories for which Joseph seemed to have a propensity to talk about. Both Joseph's father and Josiah Stoll testify for Joseph, and it's unclear whether he receives a conviction for this, but it does seem that this is a really big deal and it taints him in terms of the surrounding community. It also seems to be a big pivot point for Joseph personally. He recognizes that he could get into trouble with the law around his seer stone use, and he needs to do something quite different. He testifies in the trial that he's been trying to not do treasure digging and that it's hurting his eyes. So he's making this transition and justifying why he does not want to be a treasure digger any longer. Now, we don't know a lot about what is happening in 1826 to Joseph, except that he's working for Josiah Stoll, he's going to school, he's trying to better himself, and this is probably due to the fact that he wants to court Emma. Isaac Hale recounts that Joseph came to him wanting to marry his daughter, and he complained that he didn't approve of Joseph's profession and that he was a stranger, meaning that he wasn't a Christian or a Methodist. And it seems that Joseph really takes this to heart and he tries to improve himself and to prove to Isaac Hale that he is worthy of his daughter. By the end of 1826, Joseph has moved from Josiah Stoll's place through to Joseph Knight Sr. and is working for him. Josiah Stoll and Joseph Knight Sr. are friends, and they are looking out for Joseph as he's trying to improve his circumstance. By January 1827, Joseph still hasn't proven to Isaac that he's worthy to be his son-in-law, so he elopes with Emma by taking her to New York and marrying her with the help of Joseph Knight Sr. This is a cowardly act, and Joseph Smith reflects on this in the Book of Mormon when the priests of Noah take the daughters of the Lamanites and steal them away. I think it's notable in the text that the word used is ashamed, and I think this is Joseph's feeling about the situation, because Joseph is really respectful of other men, and to do this is a really big slight. It's reported by some of Emma's family that Isaac Hale was out to kill Joseph because of the such disrespect that Joseph had made towards Emma. Josiah Stoll actually took the couple and transported them to Manchester to the Smith family home. Later that year, Emma was able to effect a reconciliation with the help of her sister. And this mirrors another story in the Book of Mormon where the priests of Noah put forward the daughters that they had stolen to take for wife, and those wives appeased the king of the Lamanites so that they wouldn't be killed, and in fact they were given some land and property. And this is what happened to Joseph, that the reconciliation afforded the opportunity for the couple to move from Manchester back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and to be on the Hale residence. And in another story in the Book of Mormon in the same timeline is the idea of Alma, righteous Alma, leaving the court of Noah, going into the wilderness, and effectively forming a Christian community, but then being ruled over by the priests of Noah in some oppression for a while before he is rescued. Interestingly, in the Book of Mormon at this point, Alma is baptizing with a form of commitment to God, but not as an ordinance. And it could well be that Joseph in South Bainbridge has also taken those kinds of steps to ingratiate him to the Hale family. So when you start to look at these stories at the end of Mosiah with regard to Alma and also the priests of Noah, you get the understanding that these are events that are happening in Joseph's life, and he's recounting in this Christian adventure story later. Joseph and Emma were married on the 18th of January 1827. Emma was 22 years old and Joseph had just turned 21. They were certainly of age. They're not teenagers. But the idea that they would elope, that they would get married privately, that they would exclude the Hale family, this was a massive heartache to them. Emma was described by family members as the favourite, so her loss was particularly felt. And she was educated and she was industrious. There's some indications that she had a little dairy farm, like a cow, that she milked for milk and cheese. She was accomplished in singing and music, and she was really quite well educated. She explains much later that she didn't know she was getting married. She went on a trip to go see Joseph and where he was staying with Joseph Knight Sr., and they convinced her to get married. And so she left home that day believing it was just a day trip, and she didn't come back. Josiah Stoll transported them to Manchester, New York, where they stayed in the frame house with Lucy and Joseph Sr. It was a crowded household with many children. There wasn't much privacy, and it was certainly a downgrade from the home that she had left of the Hales' homestead. The Smiths really liked Emma. She was sophisticated, she was interesting, she had great stories to tell, and they enjoyed having her in their home. But for Emma, she was quite lonely. She missed her family. The kind of situation that she was in Manchester was not great. Joseph was day laboring and he sometimes got drunk. There's some accounts where she had to kind of take care of him. They were embarrassing. And there were some moments where she regretted her decision. At some point, she wrote to her parents requesting her goods, maybe even her cows, so that she could have a bit of an income, so that she could improve their life circumstances in Manchester. Isaac Hale relates that he said that her goods were hers, that she could come get them, and so the couple employed a neighbour, Peter Ingersoll, to drive down with a wagon with the idea that they would be able to pick up goods and bring them back to Palmyra. We have two accounts of this meeting, one from the perspective of Isaac Hale, father-in-law, and one from Peter Ingersoll, talking about this trip and the reconciliation, particularly between Joseph and his father-in-law. It's a tense meeting. The old man cried because of the loss of his daughter, and Joseph cried in response and in sorrow for what he had done. That Isaac Hale, talked about his treasure digging and how bad this was, and Joseph responded that he was prepared to give this up because he knew it wasn't right. Isaac Hale invited the couple, with Emma newly pregnant, to come to Harmony, Pennsylvania and stay with them. That if they would do that, and if Joseph gave up his seerstone looking and took up a profession, perhaps farming, he would sort him out and make it possible for them to have an income. Peter Ingersoll relates that on the way home, Joseph tells him that in order to give up treasure digging, this will be a hard thing because people will want him to do that because he's got such a gift for it. And Peter Ingersoll relates that that was the case when they got back. But the opportunity to move to Harmony, Pennsylvania was very fortuitous. They had recently acquired the gold plates. They were getting some pushback from the neighbors. This was a chance to start again. And so Joseph and Emma were made plans to leave. Peter Ingersoll also relates that Joseph got $50 from Martin Harris, who was intrigued by their story, and that was the money that they needed to be able to move from Manchester through to Harmony, Pennsylvania. Emma's brother Alva came up and picked them up and delivered them to the family farm. Isaac Hale recounts his disappointment when the couple come, because they bring a box with them, which Joseph relates that there are gold plates inside that are special and that he's going to utilize to translate. Isaac believes that this is just another facet of this treasure digging imaginary world that Joseph is involved in, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. It sours the relationship even more than just the elopement. Isaac moves the couple into a little farmhouse just a couple of 100 yards from the main family home. There he hopes that Joseph will make good on his promise and become a bit of a farmer. And Emma sets up with her cows to be able to produce milk and cheese for the local economy. This and support from the parents enable them to survive the winter well. And it's much more comfortable. The couple have their own space. Emma has her friends back and her family, and generally things are looking pretty bright. This is the Hale homestead in Harmony, Pennsylvania. It's a 2-story mansion, basically, and it's beautiful and very comfortable. Isaac and his wife Elizabeth had moved to the area some 30 years prior. They had worked the land well. Isaac was a great hunter. He got money from sending his goods down the Susquehanna River, and they had built themselves quite an established space. In 1828, Isaac is in his 60s. He's 40 years older than the couple, and he's really interested in their well-being, but he also does not want to deal with foolishness. The family are devout Methodists. Elizabeth's brother, Nathaniel, is the local Methodist minister. Joseph's folk magic beliefs cause a stir in the area, particularly when he soon starts working on the Book of Mormon project with Martin Harris. But fortunately for Joseph, Pennsylvania is incredibly tolerant around religion, because William Penn, the founder, had been a modalist in England and been imprisoned for his beliefs. So when he set up Pennsylvania as a commonwealth, he did so with the understanding that it would be a bastion of religious tolerance and refuge for those willing to serve God. Joseph was afforded a significant amount of protection because the family believed strongly in the values of the state. Joseph recounts in his 1838 history that the Hales family protected them, that they made it possible for the Book of Mormon to come forth. But there was a social cost to this. Isaac was revered in his local community and served on a number of important positions. But after the Smiths came, he was no longer invited to those positions. Joseph and Emma lived in a little comfortable cottage just down from the main family house, and the county road ran between the houses right past the front doors. So there was a lot of coming and going past these particular properties. In January or February of 1828, Martin Harris came down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and met with Joseph and took some characters that Joseph wrote down back east to notable universities to test whether this was something real. We know he met with Charles Anthon and possibly others, determining that this was something that was accurate. Joseph started the Book of Mormon dictation around the same time, utilizing Reuben Hale as a scribe and also Emma. Martin came and became his dedicated scribe from April the 12th right through to June the 14th. Together they worked on the initial manuscript of the Book of Mormon. This was very difficult for the Hales family to watch, because this was the time where Joseph should have been working on his farm to provide for growth during the summer months. The opportunity to plant in the spring so you could harvest in the autumn was a big opportunity that the Hales saw Joseph squandering. Likewise, Martin's wife Lucy was incredibly concerned because, again, he was a farmer and he should have been at home making sure that his crops were in for the summer. This represented an incredible economic gamble. Mid-June 1828, Martin returned back to Palmyra with the manuscript to convince his wife that this was something worthwhile, and the Smiths went about preparing for their baby, which was born on June the 15th. Tragedy struck. The newborn baby died quickly. Emma was gravely ill. And a few weeks later, when Joseph traveled to Palmyra to check on Martin and the manuscript, Martin had lost it. It's hard to describe how devastating these losses were. They'd lost their baby, they'd lost their income, they'd lost the manuscript, they'd lost friends and family over this. It was a big deal. Returning to Harmony, Pennsylvania was a humbling experience. Everything that Joseph had worked towards was now lost. These were dark days. Joseph started getting revelation. He got Doctrine and Covenants section 3, which is the first kind of sign that Joseph is getting these kind of messages that he was going to then act on. The revelation pointedly told him that Martin was a wicked man who had defrauded him. And Joseph sought solace in Emma's Methodist community. He tried to join the church, but was quickly rebuffed by Emma's cousins, who, because of his necromancy, his talking to spirits, and this idea of folk magic, suggested that he needed to repent or remove himself from the church. It was a difficult and dark next few months. Joseph hadn't put any crops in the ground. There was nothing to eat. The Hales family withdrew their support, and Joseph Knight Sr. Told the story that he had to go and support the family with means so they could get through the winter. This was Joseph's dark night of the soul, and it changed the trajectory of the production of the Book of Mormon in some dramatic ways. Cast out of Emma's Methodist church, not supported by them, became huge themes in the Book of Mormon of haughty religious people who would not sustain the poor. And if he was going to be close to God, he needed to do it outside the established religions of the time. At the beginning of 1829, things had got worse for the Smith family in Manchester. They were told that their tenancy on the land was coming to an end, and they would have to move in with Hiram and his family in the log cabin. The Smith parents and some of the youngest siblings who were still at home would now be homeless. We don't know if it was this that kick-started the Book of Mormon project again, or it was something else, but in February, something incredible happened. Joseph Smith Sr. came to visit his son, and Joseph gave him a revelation to introduce him to the work of God. Up until this time, Joseph Smith Sr. had spurned organized religions and clung to his universal beliefs, and this was a massive sign that his heart had changed, maybe due to some of the things that had happened to Joseph in the previous 6 months that were quite hard, and that he realized Joseph Smith Jr. was involved in a great work. This must have been hugely motivating for Joseph, who after this dark night of the soul had produced this fruit of the gospel. Martin Harris came the next month in March, and the pair kind of reconciled. He got Doctrine and Covenants section 5 as a revelation to Martin to explain why Martin could not see the plates. And this is corroborated by Isaac Hale in his affidavit. There is some indication from the text of that revelation that Martin did a little scribing for Joseph. But the big breakthrough happened on April the 5th, 1829, when Oliver Cowdery and Joseph's brother Samuel arrived in Harmony, Pennsylvania to help him. Oliver, as a school teacher, had been boarding with the Smiths and had heard about the Book of Mormon project and wanted to be involved. So after the school year was finished, he took his money and travelled with Samuel south. Joseph Smith relates in his 1832 history that the Hales were just about to turn him out and evict him from the property. But when Oliver came, things turned around quickly. Oliver gave his savings from his job to Joseph to put a mortgage down on the property and to distance himself from the Hales economically. This agreement with Isaac Hale was signed on the 6th of April, 1829. And from April 7th right through to June the 1st, Oliver became the primary scribe for Joseph in Harmony, Pennsylvania. We know that Hiram Smith came to visit in May of 1829 because Joseph got a revelation for him. Joseph Knight Sr. also talks about the fact that the men were really poor in trying to produce the Book of Mormon, and so he furnished some goods, for which he also got a revelation in May of 1829. In Western New York, Oliver had made friends with David Whitmer, and the two had been corresponding back and forth about Joseph's project with regard to the Book of Mormon. By the end of May 1829, things become really difficult for Joseph and Oliver in the production of the Book of Mormon. We don't know exactly what happened, but we know from a later letter that Joseph writes to Oliver that the situation is resolved, and it seems to indicate that some clergy were up in arms about Joseph, and it became really difficult for them to stay. Oliver wrote to his friend David Whitmer in Fayette, New York, and asked him to come and rescue the project. On the 1st of June 1829, Oliver and Joseph travelled with David through to Fayette, New York, to the Whitmer home where they would spend the next couple of months. While they were there, they secured a copyright, a title page was written, the Book of Mormon was completed, and there were moves to publish the Book of Mormon in nearby Palmyra. Oliver then moved in with Hiram Smith, and together they produced a printer's manuscript. Because of the manuscript being lost the year before, they were very careful to create a copy and then to deliver pages back and forth to Grandin's for publishing so that they could keep it safe. Meanwhile, by October, Joseph was back in Harmony, Pennsylvania at his cottage, trying to make that work for a winter. Joseph and Oliver wrote back and forth about the production, and we get a few details about Joseph's life in Harmony, including the understanding that Joseph Knight Sr. is really interested in this project and wants to buy many books. It seems that Joseph gets some funds from him because he manages to purchase a box house from a nearby property and drag it in the winter through to his house and attach it onto it, which improves his house by another 8 bedrooms. It seems that Joseph is going to solve his parents' and younger siblings' homelessness situation by moving them down to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to his own cottage, which he's added on to. The year ends with a lot of optimism about the coming forth and publication of the Book of Mormon and Joseph's economic ability to provide for his family and particularly his parents. This is the Grandin printing press on the main road of Palmyra Township. Joseph Smith travelled here in January of 1830 to settle a copyright dispute. He also became aware that the local Palmyra people were going to boycott the publication of the Book of Mormon and not buy it. This caused Martin Harris to panic. He had mortgaged his farm for the publication of the Book of Mormon, and now with this development, he felt like he was going to lose. So he asked the Smiths to sign an agreement that he would be able to recover his money first to secure his property. This meant that Joseph and other investors like Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Knight Sr. might not see their money for a long time. So Joseph, in February of 1830, sent Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Knight Sr., Hiram Page, and Josiah Stoll to Canada to sell the international copyright by revelation for a great sum of money, cutting Martin out. The inclusion of these particular men suggests that Josiah Stoll and Hiram Page were also investors in this project. They needed to see a financial return and were happy to kind of get an initial payout. The trip was a failure and the revelation just did not come to pass. The men doubled down on the veracity of the spiritual nature of the Book of Mormon. And so when it started rolling off the press in late March of 1830, they were excited about the prospect of its development. On the 6th of April, exactly a year after Joseph had signed an agreement with Isaac Hale, they organized a church with 6 members as per New York statute for the establishment of an organization. Joseph returned to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where he started working his farm, hoping to take care of his needs. But back and forth to South Bainbridge and Colesville in teaching the gospel and promoting the Book of Mormon with Joseph Knight Sr. and Josiah Stoll. After some baptisms in the area in late June, Joseph was re-arrested for his 1826 glass-looking charge. He went through 2 trials, one in South Bainbridge and another in Colesville, related to the idea that he might be defrauding people with the Book of Mormon in the same way that he had defrauded people with regard to treasure digging. Joseph Knight Sr. and Josiah Stoll supported Joseph and he was acquitted on the charges. But it really left a bad taste in his mouth, the idea that he would not be safe in the area. And so when he returned back to his house in Harmony, Pennsylvania, he got a number of revelations suggesting that he needed to get out and that the church would provide for his needs going forward in the future. In August, he traveled back to Fayette, New York, and found that the Whitmers and Oliver Cowdery were investing in Hiram Page's revelations with regard to the coming forth of Zion. They all believed that it was an egalitarian church and that everybody had the opportunity of receiving revelation from God as per the gifts of the Spirit. Joseph got Doctrine and Covenants section 28, telling the men that the seer stone that Hiram Page was using was being infiltrated by the devil and those revelations needed to be burned. There was only one person to get revelation for the church, and that was Joseph. Even Joseph's right-hand man, Oliver Cowdery, could be a spokesman, but his words weren't authoritative enough to speak for the church. Joseph got his own revelation on the location of Zion and then sent Oliver Cowdery, Ziba Peterson, Parley P. Pratt, and John Whitmer through to Missouri to Independence, where they would have access to Indian Territory and the New Jerusalem. On that trip, they traveled through Kirtland, Ohio, where Parley P. Pratt had lived and where Sidney Rigdon was his minister. They managed to convert him to the Book of Mormon, and Sidney Rigdon traveled to New York to meet Joseph. Sidney Rigdon became Joseph's scribe in these new revelations and also his translation of the Bible that he was producing. When persecution intensified, Sidney Rigdon invited Joseph and the saints to move to Kirtland, Ohio, where they would join with the saints who had been baptized by the missionaries going out. Early 1831, Joseph received a revelation that this is what the Lord wanted, and so he and others moved to Kirtland, Ohio, and that became the head of the church.